Hola, me llamo Sinead, pero mi castellano es muy mal, so I'll speak in English. I'm just going to give a little bit of the background of the regulations in Ireland, the things that govern home educators there. The right to choose the education of our children has been enshrined in the Irish Constitution since 1931. And there are a few articles in the Constitution that protects the rights. So the Constitution says, the state acknowledges that the primary and natural educator of the child is the family, and guarantees to respect the inalienable right and duty of parents to provide, according to their means, for the religious and moral, intellectual, physical and social education of their children. The Constitution also says, parents shall be free to provide this education in their homes, or in private schools, or in schools recognised or established by the state. The state shall not oblige parents in violation of their conscience and lawful preference to send their children to schools established by the state or to any particular type of school designated by the state. So we are very lucky. That is our baseline where Irish home educators can start from. More recently, in 2000, a new law was passed called the Education, and in brackets, Welfare Act of 2000. And this act refers to another article in the Constitution, which says, the state shall, however, as guardian of the common good, require, in view of actual conditions, that the children receive a certain minimum education, moral, intellectual, and social. So, the Education Welfare Act provided for the establishment of a new government body called the National Education Welfare Board, NEWB, what we'll call it, or NEWB. Its functions include the maintaining of a register of all the children in Ireland who are receiving an education outside of recognised schools. So for the first time, they set up an official register and called for all home educating parents to come forward and apply for the registration of their children. Along with the law, the NEWB developed a set of guidelines, operational guidelines, and that is what they use in the application of the new regulations. In Ireland, you have to either be enrolled in school or registered with NEWB from the age of 6. So that's the constitutional context and the law. So part of the story so far, this isn't the whole story, and every home educator has a different experience. So, but really, the law came into being in 2000, and it took probably 5-6 years before registration really began to happen. Because the NEWB don't just deal with home educators, and this was one of the problems that home educator families had from the very beginning. NEWB also oversaw truancy from school, and that was a much bigger problem for them than the small number of home educators that they knew about. So part of the story so far, since the establishment of the NEWB, a number of issues have arisen for both the state agency and home educators. From the outset, there were many home ed families who felt the new legislation was unconstitutional because we already had the right enshrined in the Constitution. They felt there was no need for this new legislation. And many refused to participate in the registration process. Many continue to refuse to participate in the registration process. We only have anecdotal evidence about the numbers, so we can really only guess and estimate based on if one family is registered, then how many do they know who aren't registered. The newbie, as I said, have a large remit over tackling truancy problems. They cover every school in the country, and this work takes up the bulk of their resources. Until 2009, there was only one member of staff assigned to work on the registration and assessment of home educators. In 2009, a unit manager was appointed. So, once a manager is in place, the manager will inevitably find more things to manage. At this point, the NEWB have registered 810 children. They've now set up a panel of assessors who carry out the assessment visits in each geographic region. We don't have details of the unsuccessful applications. We only have the number of children on the official register. In Ireland, there are a couple of different home education organisations. EHEC, who Carmel represents today, is one of the longest running groups. And members of EHEC became aware during 2011, maybe a little before, that some assessors had begun mentioning that they would be returning for an ongoing monitoring visit at some undetermined time in the future. It soon became clear that the newbie had introduced this concept of a review assessment without any consultation with the home ed community or even referral to their own guidelines. The guidelines, along with the legislation, only provide for a preliminary assessment, and if that preliminary assessment is considered inconclusive, the assessor can't make up their mind if a minimum education is being reached, is being provided, then they will apply to carry out a comprehensive assessment. But there is no allowance for a continuing monitoring situation. It's supposed to be preliminary assessment, and that's it. Preliminary assessment if there's a problem, and a comprehensive, but not a continuous or a review. So this concerned a lot of people. And this development played a large role in the establishment of a newer organisation called Home Ed Ireland, HEI. I'm also a member of HEN, but I'm here for HEI today. So we set up HEI primarily to act as a watchdog for home ed in Ireland. Most members of HEI are also members of HEN, and both organisations work in close consultation. We believe the newbie is acting outside its remit by attempting to carry out these ongoing monitoring review assessment visits. Some recently assessed families have reported being told to expect a review assessment within 6 to 9 months of receiving their letter of registration. Families who had previously registered their first child, when applying for registration of a second child, for example, found that when the assessor would make the phone call to arrange the date, the assessor would very casually suggest, "Oh, while I'm there, I'll carry out a follow-up assessment of your older child." Families felt quite unable to refuse this kind offer because they were then worried that if they say no to that, how will that affect the application to register their subsequent children? So there is an imbalance, a sense of imbalance of power and authority here. So a lot felt they weren't able to say no. And this really influenced an awful lot of what HEI wants to do. So what HEI sets out to do is to help people and support them if they want to say no to some of these new things that are creeping in. So we write letters to the newbie and point out that they're behaving outside of the law, that they are stepping over the bounds of their remit, that they are changing the language and moving the goalposts, as it were. For those families who refuse to apply for permission to home educate, there have been some significant developments very recently as well. In March, the newbie attempted to prosecute the parents of home educated children when the parents didn't respond to a school attendance notice. These are not normally issued to home educating families, but they're very common in school truancy cases, where if the child still doesn't attend school regularly, the newbie issue an SAN, a school attendance notice, to say, your child has to be in school on this date. So they issued a school attendance notice to a home educating family. The family appeared in court in March without legal representation. They represented themselves. And when their case came up, they told the judge they felt they were there due to an invalid summons. The judge asked if this was a constitutional issue. And when they said yes, he stated he couldn't hear the case until the constitutional matters were sorted out. So the family thanked him and walked out of the courtroom. The newbie were not pleased, as you can imagine. What the newbie will do next remains to be seen. It's anyone's guess. We're just waiting to find out. So there's some of the political things and some of the situations and experiences that have taken place since registration and regulation came into force in Ireland. So I will pass you over to Carmel, who will finish telling some more of the story.
My name is Carmel Duffy, and HEN, the Home Education Network, as Sinead said, asked me to come on their behalf, and they paid part of the cost of my coming here. But I was interested in coming personally also because I think I observe recently a sort of a phenomenon that's arising in the whole arena about home education. I suspect that there is some kind of a movement within Europe to regulate homeschooling, at least, if not to eradicate it. For instance, it has, as we all know, it is illegal in Germany. It was made illegal in Sweden last year. And in my own country, and it seems from what I've been hearing from the Spanish people here, similar things are happening in Spain. There is increasing regulation, and I don't know why. I'm an area representative in Ireland, so my phone number is on the HEN literature, and people often phone me to talk about they're taking their child out of school, how to proceed, or they're not going to send their child to school, or difficulties or things that come up, just to talk. It's just very informal. It's a support thing, really. But also I try to give them information or to put them in touch with somebody who knows what that area of the thing, if I don't know. And I have had an increase in the number of phone calls in the last year, say, from people who are, in my opinion, being bullied by the local school attendance setup and intimidated, and pretty much, rather than being told that they do have a right to do this and explain to them how to do it correctly or in compliance with the current regulations, they've been kind of said, no, you can't, and no, we do this, we do that, if you do that. So I think that's part of it. I don't know why. I think one of the it doesn't matter really, perhaps, but one of the reasons I think is that home education families used to be a very small number, and in recent years the numbers have increased significantly, which means they come naturally to the attention of the authorities more easily, and they're aware that the numbers are growing too. And another aspect of it is, I think, at some level it may be recognised that potentially it's a very revolutionary force. If you don't send your children to school when they're 6 years old and they go through maybe 12 or 13 years of this process, then they perhaps will retain more independent ways of thinking than the people who go to school. Certainly different ways of thinking. They may not be more independent, and therefore they are not going to see things in the mainstream kind of way, and I think that that may be a factor. Anyway, before I go on too long, following up from what Sinead talked about, the family who were in court, they're personally known to me, and the mother of the family has given me an account of their case, which I can read if there's time. But that family are due back in court early in May, to the same court, I believe, in a follow-up to the case that they had. My philosophy on it is I've had 10 children with my husband, and we homeschooled them all. Most of their lives. My eldest child went to school when she was 16 years old, and that was the first time any of our children went to school. At the time we had 9 children. And my daughter is now 34 years old, and she has 3 children, and she's homeschooling them. And so I have 4 of my 7 grandchildren are currently homeschooling. So I've been doing it for a long time, but most of the time I was doing it was before this law that Sinead was explaining was passed. So it was under the constitutional setup. When the law came in, I was involved in negotiations with the government, the Department of Education, while the law was being framed, and so was my daughter. She was in university at the time, but I decided not to register. I found I objected to it on several very important grounds. One of them was that for the first time education was equated with welfare. If the child was receiving formal education, their welfare, a vital aspect of their welfare, it was perceived, was being taken care of. And if they weren't receiving formal education, a vital aspect of their welfare was not being taken care of. And I don't agree with that. In some contexts that's true, but not always. And also the Act, as Sinead pointed out, is supposed to apply to cases of truancy and neglect, and also cases of homeschooling where it's a positive choice by the parents to educate the children themselves. But I also objected to it on a more fundamental point, which is that in Ireland we had an unqualified right to educate the children. In fact, the Constitution says we are the prime educators of our children. And I believe that if we engaged in this debate and engaged with Newby and applied for registration, then we are giving them a legal grounds. We are asking them to regulate our homeschooling, which they will do according to their terms. And they're professional educators, so they're seeing it from a completely different perspective. And in the beginning, the registration and the process and all that, the monitoring was very simple and very easy, and it still is, but they can increase the amount of surveillance regulation to any degree they like once we accept the right to regulate it at all. So I just don't want to engage in that. The philosophy that my husband and I used, I believe that education, formal education as we know it in the Western world, is an industry. And that's one of the reasons why we're having so many problems, is because we're actually conflicting with an industry. And it's therefore a phenomenon of the industrial age. So it's a localised phenomenon which has only occurred in the last 250 or so years. There were always a few educated people, but kind of education for everybody. And it was only in a particular part of the world. And I think the industrial age is past now, and we're moving into a new age. I don't know what it'll be, for want of a better word. People tend to call it post-industrial age. And many, many things have changed. One of them being the majority of the population in this part of the world are quite well educated, and they're therefore well able to educate their own children. Another being that there are many reasons, anyway, I won't go on. But before that time, and outside of that time, during that time, in other parts of the world, it didn't mean that people knew nothing. People learned about how to live in their culture and their society by living in their culture. It wasn't something that was taken into a special place and done by special people. And then it was obviously part of the mechanics of how those societies worked, that the people in the society knew this, and therefore it was a convivial society. It was a society that was friendly to learning as part of living. So young people, children and older teenagers, helped out with the daily tasks of living, and in so doing they learned how to live in that society. And that was kind of the model that my husband and I used, rather than abstracting information and then sort of laying it on children in a kind of a laboratory type of situation, which essentially is what school is. I think that there's always something lost when you do that. It's more difficult, and there are many pitfalls, and one of them is actually possibly the rise of what are now called learning difficulties, which I believe are teaching difficulties. It's to do with the mechanics of the way the thing happens. But anyway, not to go on about that too much, I think it's very important to remember as well that the people we are dealing with in these negotiations with bureaucrats and government people and police and judges and lawyers and all the people in the education negotiations, they are doing a job. It's something that they're paid to do, and they do it from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. But what we are doing, and what with our children, is we are living our lives. We're not doing it because anybody pays us to do it, or because we have professional training and it's our career. We're doing it because we believe that this is a good way to bring up our children. And for that reason, the two areas are deeply different and incompatible. And then there's also the thing that, you know, you may get along very well with your local education officer or whatever they're called in your part of the world, but they can change. You know, a new government can come in, or a change in the bureaucracy, and you may have a completely different person, and they may have a different approach, whereas you know, and your children, you're always with those children in their lives, even when, like mine, they're grown up and have children of their own. It's a human thing. It's not a kind of industrial sort of thing. Is it a good idea? Is there time to read this thing for Monica? I think maybe 5 or 6 minutes would read it, yes?
We have time.
Okay. It's Monica O'Connor, and she has 7 children, and 3 of them have now passed the age, like they're past 18. Well, actually, one is only 17, but he's in university doing a music degree, which he got into because he studied music on his own at home and did his exams, and then he got offered a place. And then she has 2 older children who are also over 18, and then they have 4 younger children who are being educated at home. So Monica says, the Irish Constitution gives specific recognition to a family's right to home education. There was an informal group of home educators on the contact list formed after Darren Malloy had an Alternatives in Education conference in June 1988. Out of that, the Sawalia, which is the Irish for at home, newsletter was published. This went on for several years, the Sawalia, maybe 6 or 7 years at least. There were annual camping get-togethers in generous families' fields. It was very informal and very much just support and to allow the children to come together and so on. When the Education Welfare Bill was published in 1998, families got together to form the Home Education Network. and campaigned for changes and revisions. One TD, that's a member of the Parliament, who seemed to understand everything we said and to propose unsuccessful amendments to the bill when it was being voted on in the Parliament, was Michael D. Higgins, and he's now the Irish President. Michael D. is a lawyer, a law lecturer, and quite a radical man, I may say so. I'm doing injustice to so many people, but anyway, she says, but I'll give a short history lesson. A lot of work was done on revising the guidelines for assessment of education in places other than recognised schools. Due to HEN's input, the guidelines were completely rewritten. While still having many flaws, they are a huge improvement on the original proposals. So in that way, the negotiations between HEN and the government organs were successful because the guidelines improved. But in many, many ways, I feel that the negotiations have been unsuccessful because we seem to lose ground all the time, because the government, the educational establishment, set up the whole playing field and all the rules, and we are playing on their field. They're not playing on our field, and it's very difficult to turn that around. The Education Welfare Act became law in the year 2000. The National Education Welfare Board was established. Assessors were trained and piloted with families, and a home education assessor spoke at the HEN conference in 2006. Every year, I meant to tell you a bit about that, what HEN actually does. It's quite an informal group. We have meetings in various parts of the country, a bit like Stephanie spoke about. You know, I might organise something in my area and notify the families, and we'd have some kind of activity, something the children can do, and then maybe meet the parents, sit down and have a cup of coffee or tea and a chat. And often it's a learning activity, but sometimes it's just recreational. And they would go on sort of randomly when people have the energy or there's enough people to bother. And then we have every year a conference which lasts usually for about, like this one, 3 or 4 days, where we meet somewhere like this. And a lot of things happen. There are many activities going on for the children and many meetings for the adults, and it's a lot of fun and the kids love it. And then it also has a supportive role, because there are representatives around the country like me who will speak to people who want to talk about things they're worried about or problems. And that's partly sharing information and support. And then there's the area where we negotiate with the government bodies, some people on our behalf. So there's quite a lot of functions there. There was a meeting of home education families about assessment in November 2006. And one of the fathers, who was an ex-English civil servant, drew up a declaration based on Irish court judgments in home education cases. It was a form of self-registration for families who believed they would be diluting their constitutional right to home educate by following the newbie procedure. So 5 families sent in that declaration. I didn't do it, but again, I felt it's, you know, we're asking them, we're asking for permission, we're asking them to register us to do something that we are doing. So why would we? So Monica, this woman who's written this, she did send in this declaration. So 26 months later, Newby acknowledged the declaration. That's how long it took. But that was in 2007. But Sinead and I were talking about this, and the law was passed in the year 2000, but we both think that very little was kind of done about it for about 7 or 8 years. And they were hoping that people would come in and ask to be registered, and a number of people did, but they knew, partly from the negotiations, that there were quite a lot of other families who didn't, and then they started to get tough and say, right, you know, we're going to do something about this, bring on the power thing. So anyway, 26 months later, she got an acknowledgement of the declaration. She was told it wasn't an application for assessment, and she was asked to send in applications for her children, who were then aged 14 and 8. They didn't do that. They asked again in in March of the year 11. So that was 2 years later again, for their younger children, who were now, the little girl who was 7. So at the time, her husband and several other people were meeting with Newby every few months to negotiate and to, you know, try to make their point of view to Newby. And her husband was the liaison officer for Hen with Newby for 4 years. They then applied, they were fostering children as well, and they then applied for a foster child to home educate. And they managed to be successful. They were registered, the foster child, they were registered as the educators of the foster child. People came from Newby to their home to see them, to talk about it, and to meet the foster child. And they were assessed and they were registered. So they're now registered as educators of the foster child, but they have about 4 children of their own who are home educated, and they're not registered. So, but during that meeting, the Newby people pleaded with them to register. They said they knew their children were okay, they felt they were okay, but they felt that all home educated children needed to be assessed so that they could find the few who were educationally neglected and help them. So anyway, they didn't send in an application to be registered. Then the next thing that happened was very interesting. They were then passed on to the school attendance section of Newby, which is the section that deals with truancy. And an officer called Dan O'Shea from that section phoned up and said he was coming the next day to discuss their children's school attendance. But her husband said that he was happy to discuss home education with them, but he wasn't discussing school attendance. So they waited all day the next day, and the guy didn't show up. And they were all laughing, and they thought this was very funny. They wrote to him then, and they asked him to document and verify their obligation to apply for assessment. In other words, they said, you've asked us to apply for assessment. Please tell us what, on what grounds, you know, you can do this. What power do you have to ask us to do this? And he replied with the standard answer. So what actually happened was this Dan O'Shea went and put 2 of their children's names on the roll in their local school. He enrolled them in the school without the parents' consent or signatures or without asking them. And then they were served with a school attendance notice, 1 for each child, that they were causing their children not to attend school, and that's how they arrived in court. Now, I don't know, because this hasn't all come out legally, but it appears to me that that is illegal. I actually know parents in Ireland, in my own locality, single parents who have tried to put their children's name down in a school, and because these would be mums, and because the father wasn't there to sign the application to get enrolled the child, they couldn't actually enroll their child in school. So how can an officer of the school attendance section of Newby register your child, enroll your child in a school? It's not his, he doesn't have the power to do that. But nonetheless, he did it, and based on that, they were brought to court, which is what Sinead was talking about. So anyway, that's all only, you know, very detailed and very. All the law is such a strange kind of phenomenon. It could go this way, it could go that way. There's no telling. But my overall concern is that there is a kind of attempt to enforce universal education throughout Europe. And I have always held myself that if it became such with my own children that I had to do as much work, school work with them at home as if they were at school, that I would send them to school, because I would be an unschooler, and I wouldn't be happy to have to spend all those hours with my children doing lessons. And there are teachers at school, it's their job, they're paid to do it, they're trained to do it. Why would I bother spending all those hours? You know, if there was going to be regular testing of my children when they were young and when they were at home. Just to let you know then, my children, all of them except my 14-year-old who's still homeschooling, they're all, well, the next 2 up from him are musicians, and they're just trying to get established. They're not really making a living, but they're sort of making half a living, and they do odd jobs and things to supplement the music. One of my sons is actually a professional poker player. He never went to school, and he's been a very successful poker player. He's actually retiring from that at the moment. One of my daughters works, she takes care of autistic people in a residential situation, a bit like a Steiner community. My son manages a farm in a similar kind of situation. One of my daughters manages a restaurant. Quite a lot of them have been we were involved in horses. My husband is a horseman, so 4 of my children at one time were jockeys in horse racing in Ireland, which is quite a big industry. So, you know, they are all, none of them are terribly rich. The poker playing man is probably the richest of my children in money, but they're all, you know, doing okay things. They're all able to pay their bills. Despite the recession, it's of course more difficult for everybody, but they have, you know, the misgivings I had when they were little children and wondering would they be okay have worked out, and the children have managed to grow up and make their way in the world despite their lack of formal education. So just wanted to know that.
Vamos muy bien de tiempo. Quiero agradecer tanto a Carmel como a Sinead sus interesantes presentaciones sobre la situación en Irlanda y sobre esta tendencia hacia la universalidad y las implicaciones que tiene de cierta negación de las individualidades. Quiero pasar la palabra, si no hay alguna pregunta sobre aclaración.